I have asked many brilliant scientists on the podcast to define the free energy principle, and it always makes them pretty uncomfortable. You can see that they start squirming in their seat, they get a bit uncomfortable. You kind of get the sense that they wished I asked them literally anything else. Why do you think that's the case? Why is the free energy principle such a weird kind of idea to grapple with and to explain simply?
Um, it may be because it has the same tautological simplicity as natural selection and many evolutionary theories. There, at its heart, it is just a description of the things, the way things are. And the way things are put certain constraints on how they self-organize to exist. So it, I often use the word deflationary. It's a very deflationary account. There's no sort of teleology associated with it. It's just a physicist's description of self-organization of certain kinds of things that just exist with characteristic states. So, unfortunately, the description of that kind of self-organization comes along with a lot of mathematics and a lot of concepts that people may not have been exposed to during their foundational training. And furthermore, the joy and the dangers of applying the free energy principle invoke a lot of teleology, a lot of concepts that can be interpreted in many different ways. And I think that's when you can get into hot water in terms of describing things in terms of sense making or sentience and the like. So you have to qualify your use of words a lot, which is probably why a lot of your theoreticians feel uncomfortable because they know they're going to get into trouble with somebody if they use the wrong
Yes.
word.
What do you mean by deflationary? Because obviously it's such an expansive idea. It can really describe lots of different areas of brain function. So what exactly do you mean by deflationary?
Um, I meant it in the sense that it dissolves a lot of explanations that you would otherwise have to bring to the table to understand or describe many existential things from a subjective or an objective perspective. So by deflationary, I really mean that you don't need a lot of stuff to explain anything. All
Right.
you need to do is assume that something exists, and then you have to be carefully define what you mean by something, and then describe what you mean by existence. And if you just deflate all the attendant attributes of things existing to the simple foundations, what it means to be a thing and for a thing to exist, and indeed you could actually deflate those two things into just existence in and of itself, then you don't need to appeal to lots of rhetoric and lots of philosophical notions that you will find in a functionalist interpretation of the ensuing self-organization, as I'm sure we'll
Yes.
find out during our conversation.
Yes. Makes sense. What is the best way that you have found to explain it to people? And what way seems to make the most sense? If the listeners at home trying to grapple with this idea, and me as well, I'm absolutely trying to grapple with this. Like, what's the right way to think about it?
Well, I think there are two ways, and possibly one will be best for you, depending upon how what you have been trained in or the way that you like to think about things. So, before I start, I should say that I am notoriously bad at explaining the free energy principle. And seriously, I have to rely upon younger colleagues who see the simplicity and see ways of portraying it. I have to say that usually they actually have a philosophical training, so that they are skilled in unpacking and articulating the ideas. I am not very good at it. But I can certainly talk about it with confidence because I know the underlying mathematics. So I normally offer people, two ways of understanding it. There's a high road and the low road. So the high road would be the kind of explanation that a physicist would like. And that's very much this deflationary account of self-organization and asking question by question, what do you mean by self? And then just stepping through the assumptions implicit in the very question, and then arriving at a description of self-organization that you could apply to systems like you and me. And then the low road is the story that somebody with a background in philosophy, psychology, cognitive science might appreciate. So do you want me to give you both and then see which you prefer?
Let's maybe go in the psychology side first. I have the better chance of understanding that one, and then we can see how the physics jigsaw puzzle fits into that.
Okay. Well, we may not need to do the physics jigsaw puzzle, but it's not so much a jigsaw puzzle. It's a backstory, and it ends up in exactly the same place as if you took the more functionalist low road. So the high road and the low road end up in exactly the same place, and then you can interpret the physics high road as basically, well, it had to be like that. In the sense that you can derive it from first principles. So that's quite a key aspect of the free energy principle. It is a first principles account of the way that we organize ourselves. But the low road, I think, will probably start with Plato and the students of Plato. The notion of ourselves, and in particular our brains, as constructive organs of prediction, organs of inference. The notion here that we bring to the table explanations for our sensory inputs. So this is very much, as people like Andy Clark and Neil Seth would say, this is very much perception, is very much an inside-out kind of process. It's active and constructive in the sense that the brain generates hypotheses, explanations, fantasies, hallucinations for the sensorium, and then uses the sensory input to check whether that explanation is fit for purpose. And if it's not fit for purpose, then there will be a mismatch or an error. So if I imagine, for example, that I am currently looking at your face, and I have a good prediction of what I would see, and then I compare my predictions with what I'm actually observing or sampling through my sensory epithelia, then if there's no prediction error, I know I've got a good enough explanation. So that would be the predictive processing account, probably most convincingly, or at least sort of mechanistically articulated by Helmholtz and with reference to his notion of unconscious inference, that something, you have to have something on the inside in order to perceive it. You have to have some idea about what could have caused this pattern of sensory input. And if this internal hypothesis, this explanation, this fantasy, literally meaning the brain is a fantastic organ, is sufficiently good, then you can explain away, or at least explain your sensory input. And that notion, which I repeat, Helmholtz framed in terms of unconscious inference, was unpacked in many, many different ways during the 20th century, ranging from things such as analysis by synthesis through to perceptions, hypothesis testing by psychologists such as Richard Gregory. Again, perceptions, hypothesis testing, this notion that you have to have a hypothesis. This is an active, constructive process of testing hypotheses against the sensory evidence and identifying the best explanation. So this is just inference to the best explanation by the brain as an organ, a statistical organ, an organ of predictions and hypotheses. Those ideas were then formalized by a number of different people, probably most notably people like Geoffrey Hinton and Peter Diane, who actually built a Helmholtz machine and simulated sense making and data assimilation using exactly this notion. And this notion rests upon the commitment to a generative model. So what do you mean by that? Well, a generative model is just a model, a probabilistic description of the cause and consequence in the special case that the cause are latent or hidden states out there in the world to which you do not have direct access. and the consequences of the sensory consequences of the states of affairs in the world that you can observe or register through the sensory organs that you are equipped with. So if you have a generative model, which is the probability of what would I sense if the cause was this, if the cause was a face, for example, plus some prior beliefs about the given this context, what's the probability I would be seeing a face, or there would be a face out there causing my current sensations. And that generative model can be installed in these predictive processing schemes. Probably the most popular at the moment, certainly as a metaphor for how our certain parts of our brain work, would be predictive coding. This notion that in order to do inference to the best explanation, in order, if you wanted to look at this as a sort of a process of Bayesian belief updating, in order to change my mind, to find a better explanation, better inference to the best explanation, I'm going to use the prediction errors to update my beliefs until those prediction errors are eliminated. And that, in a nutshell, would be the predictive coding view of predictive processing. There are a couple of little twists here. The first one is that that's not the complete story. The complete story would have to entertain the somewhat obvious fact that you are in charge of the way that you sample your data and the way that you sample your environment. You control where you look, what Wikipedia pages you visit, what social media channels you're committed to. So we have to put action into the game, and this reflects a sort of a pragmatic turn at the beginning of this century, that people sort of revisited the active part of active inference. Interestingly, something that featured was very much foregrounded in Helmholtz's perspective. I'm not a philosopher, but I am aware that there's a sort of a bit of a move from Kant to Helmholtz. So, Kantian ideas, I think, very consistent with this notion of perceptions, hypothesis testing, and this, the brain as a statistical organ. But what Helmholtz brought to the table was this inactive aspect, that not only do we have to make sense of data, but we also have to act in the right kind of way to gather the right data to make sense of. And you could actually celebrate that circular causality by saying, well, why do I need to make sense of data? So I know how to act. Why are you acting? So I can sample the data. So here's another sort of deflationary, it all sort of eats itself. So it dissolves the question, perception first or action first. They're just aspects of this kind of self-organization we're talking about. Yes. If you put action together, and a particular kind of action, in fact, it would be sufficient, just the kind of action that explains our reflexes, either sort of knee-jerk reflexes or autonomic reflexes, together with predictive processing, predictive coding, you then have this more generic account of predictive processing that has this inactive aspect. In my world, that's called active inference. And the active bit is just to emphasize, we're not talking about passive ingesters of data from an outside-in perspective. Not only is there an active mental construction, a constructive aspect to our sense-making, but also we physically are embodied, and we have to actually sample those data and choose how to engage and how to couple with the world. The other twist here is that not only do I have to select things to look at, but even without physically moving, I can still act on the inside, and I can endow certain sources of sensory evidence with and I can imbue them with a confidence or a weighting that it makes them preferentially or enables them to have more effect in my belief updating. So you can think of this, if you're a psychologist, as attentional selection. And if I use the word like attentional selection in the context of attentional selection, notice that to select is to do something. So even if I'm not overtly moving around or palpating my visual field with my eyes or my desk with my fingers, I can still act on the inside through this attention selection mechanism. And what that basically means is selecting the right sensory channels, the right representations, the right kind of evidence to build my beliefs in the most efficient way, to do my Bayesian belief updating in the most efficient way. So I'm going to be responding to salient information that is afforded a high degree of precision. So it's not just about minimizing prediction error. It's about minimizing precision weighted prediction error. So you'll come across quite a lot of that notion, precision weighting or precision weighted prediction errors, quite a lot in the philosophical and cognitive neuroscience literature. And I think it's quite important because it means it's not just a question of predicting what caused my sensations in order to minimize my prediction error. I also have to predict the precision. I have to predict how confident should I be in this particular kind of prediction error. A simple intuitive example of that would be if I enter a room and the lights are off, then the precision of my visual prediction errors is effectively zero. There is no useful information in my visual prediction errors. So I'm now going to attend to assign greater precision to the auditory prediction errors. So I'm going to listen very, very carefully, or I'm going to assign much more precision to my somatosensory prediction errors. I'm going to literally feel my way around and test hypotheses. If I'm, say, in a hotel room, I may have the hypothesis there's likely to be the corner of a bed within a few strides. So I'm going to feel my way, if I can't find the light switch, and confirm that hypothesis by reaching out, palpating the world, gathering data in order to confirm or disconfirm my hypothesis that the bed is in this location in relation to me. But at the same time, I'm also on the inside attending to and selecting not my visual data or my visual prediction errors, but the somatosensory prediction errors that are coming from my skin receptors, for example, when I'm using my hands to palpate, much in the same way that a little mouse would use its whiskers to gather information and to test hypotheses in its world. So that's that just sort of speaks to this situated, embodied, sort of triple E, 4E inactive aspect of this kind, this interpretation of sense making. The final perspective on this is just to sort of stand back and say, okay, well, I can understand that intuitively in terms of prediction errors. Is there a more mathematical way of casting this? And I've already alluded to that this is formally one kind of inference using Bayesian belief updating under a particular kind of generative model. The kind of generative model that is implied by predictive coding is a model where your world is composed of an enormous number of latent states, all of which can vary continuously, in theory, from plus infinity to minus infinity. And you are making certain assumptions about the probability distributions that induce this notion of prediction errors. Technically, you're assuming Gaussian, normally distributed, bell-shaped distributed uncertainty, and that allows you to write down everything in terms of prediction errors. However, if you just stand back from that and say, well, more generally, what am I trying to do? Well, it looks as if, or you can write down these predictive coding schemes and indeed these active inference schemes in terms of minimizing precision-weighted prediction errors that just are an estimate of the plausibility of the data that you are currently sampling. So you write that down mathematically as the logarithm of the probability of these sensory data given my generative model of those data. Now that, of course, averages over a whole set of unknowns, all the unknown latent states in the world, all the parameters of your generative model, all the associations and contingencies, averages out mathematically that's called marginalization. So, and I say that to say that this probability of the data given my model of the world is called the marginal likelihood. So you can write down predictive processing and predictive coding, and indeed any other scheme that conforms to this self-evidencing principle or the free energy principle as just changing my model of the world in order to make the data that I am currently sampling as likely as possible.
Yes.
I use the word self-evidencing. Why am I entitled to do this? And this is one example of multiple ways of interpreting the same thing. So this is, if you like, an illustration of this deflationary argument. I've deflated everything that just to be described as sense making in this active way is simply to be described as maximizing the model evidence, the evidence for your model of the world. Why? Because the probability of the data given a model is called model evidence in Bayesian statistics. So if I'm trying to minimize my precision weighted prediction error, that just means I am trying to maximize my marginal likelihood of my sensations given my model, which is exactly the same mathematically as maximizing the evidence for or gathering evidence for my model of the lived world, which is just, if you like, a 21st century version of self-evidencing. They're mathematically all exactly the same. They're just different views on the same underlying quantity. Is there a generic way of describing this quantity as it's actually used in practice? Yes, that's the variational free energy. So the variational free energy is what's called a bound approximation to this central quantity, the log of the probability of my sensations, my exchange with this world, given my model of this world. And that's what the free energy principle describes. It just describes anybody or anything as looking as if it's trying to minimize its free energy. And then we can do the high road, which would be why that can't be any other way. But perhaps we shouldn't go there. We have enough material to work with already.
That was amazing. I think that was incredibly well said. It's bringing together just so many fascinating pillars of biology and psychology with such explanatory framework and such explanatory power. I think that was so well explained. I'll put up lots of diagrams and formulas and equations for the listeners to hopefully help them follow along with that, because I know maybe at parts that got a bit technical. But I thought it was really well explained. The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free